At my cousin's wedding, my dad turned to the groom's parents and said, "He's the disappointment. We don't talk about him unless we need money." My uncle laughed. I'd paid for the open bar, the flowers, even the DJ, quietly, anonymously, until that moment. So I walked up to the mic, thanked everyone for coming, and let them know the venue was paid in full by me until 10 minutes ago. Then I handed the manager a bill and walked out. The music stopped before my car left me exit. I, 29M, never expected to be standing in front of 200 wedding guests with a microphone in my hand, watching my cousin's perfect day crumble around me. But sometimes life forces your hand, and that moment came when my dad decided to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered. The day started like any other family wedding. My cousin had been planning this for months, and I'd been quietly helping behind the scenes. Nobody knew I was the one funding the open bar that everyone was enjoying, or that I'd covered the cost of those elaborate floral arrangements everyone kept complimenting. The DJ spinning music that had people dancing? My contribution too. I preferred it that way. Anonymous generosity felt better than making a show of it. My relationship with my family had always been complicated. Dad saw me as the black sheep, the one who didn't follow the traditional path he'd mapped out. While my cousins became doctors and lawyers, I'd built my own business from scratch. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and more importantly, it was profitable enough to help family members when they needed it. They just never knew where the help was coming from. The ceremony went off without a hitch. My cousin looked radiant. Her new husband seemed genuinely happy, and for a moment I felt good about contributing to their special day. The reception started smoothly, with guests mingling and enjoying the premium bar service I'd arranged. Everything was perfect until the groom's parents approached our family table. They seemed like nice people, making polite conversation about the wedding and how beautiful everything looked. The groom's father mentioned something about wondering who had such generous taste in arranging the bar service, since it was clearly top-shelf everything. That's when my dad decided to insert himself into the conversation. Without missing a beat, he gestured toward me and made his announcement. He told the groom's parents that I was the disappointment of the family, the one they didn't talk about unless they needed money. My uncle, sitting nearby, actually laughed at this characterization, adding his own commentary about how I was always good for a handout, but not much else. The words hit me like ice water. Here I was, having just spent a significant amount of my own money to make sure their son's wedding was memorable, and they were painting me as some kind of family failure who only existed to be their ATM. The groom's parents looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting this kind of family drama, but the damage was done. I sat there for a moment, letting their words sink in. Part of me wanted to just leave quietly, to avoid making a scene at what was supposed to be a celebration. But something inside me snapped. After years of anonymous generosity, years of helping family members while getting nothing but criticism in return, I'd reached my breaking point. I excused myself from the table and walked over to where the DJ was set up. The music was still playing, people were still dancing, and the party was in full swing. I caught the DJ's attention and asked if I could make a quick announcement. He handed me the microphone without hesitation. The music faded as I cleared my throat, and conversations gradually died down as people realized someone was about to speak. I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate my cousin's special day, mentioning how beautiful the ceremony had been and how much joy it brought me to see two people so clearly in love. Then I made my revelation. I explained to the crowd that the venue, the open bar they'd been enjoying, the elaborate floral arrangements, and even the DJ's services had all been paid for by me. I'd done it anonymously because I wanted the focus to be on the happy couple, not on who was footing the bill. The room went completely silent as this information sank in. But I wasn't finished. I continued by explaining that I'd just learned something important about family and respect, and that I felt it was time to make some adjustments to the evening's arrangements. I walked over to the venue manager, who had been standing near the entrance, and handed him a bill. I explained loudly enough for everyone to hear that I was revoking my payment authorization for all the services I'd arranged. The manager looked confused at first, then concerned as he realized what was happening. I told him that while the ceremony venue was paid for and couldn't be changed, everything else, the bar, the DJ, the extended reception space, would need immediate payment from someone else if the party was to continue. The look on my dad's face was something I'll never forget. The realization that his disappointment of a son had been bankrolling the evening's entertainment hit him like a freight train. My uncle's laughter died in his throat as he processed what had just happened. The groom's parents, who had just heard me described as a worthless family member, were now watching me demonstrate exactly how much financial power I actually held. I handed the microphone back to the DJ, who was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and terror. He knew his payment had just been revoked, but he also seemed to understand the gravity of what had just transpired. I told him he could pack up whenever he felt appropriate, then turned to walk toward the exit. The venue manager was already approaching my cousin and her new husband, clipboard in hand, clearly needing to resolve the payment situation immediately. I could hear confused murmurs spreading through the crowd as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Some guests were pulling out their phones, probably to record whatever was about to happen next. As I walked toward the door, I could hear my dad calling my name, his voice carrying a note of panic I'd never heard before. My cousin was crying, though whether from anger, embarrassment, or genuine distress, I couldn't tell. The groom looked like he was trying to figure out how to salvage his wedding reception with 200 guests and no way to pay for the bar service. I didn't turn around. I'd spent years being the family's secret benefactor, quietly covering expenses and helping out during tough times while getting nothing but criticism in return. If they wanted to paint me as a disappointment who only existed for money, then they could figure out how to handle their own financial responsibilities. The last thing I heard as I pushed through the venue doors was the music cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, and I knew that every guest inside was now fully aware that the party had just come to an end. My car was parked near the exit, and I could hear raised voices coming from inside the building as I started the engine. Update 1. The fallout began before I even made it home. My phone started ringing incessantly, calls from my dad, my uncle, my cousin, even some extended family members who'd been at the reception. I let them all go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to deal with the aftermath of what I'd just done, and honestly, I needed time to process whether I'd made the right choice. When I finally listened to the messages hours later, the range of emotions was staggering. My dad's first call was angry, demanding to know how I could embarrass the family like that. His second message was more panicked, asking how they were supposed to explain to 200 guests why the reception had ended so abruptly. By his fourth message, his tone had shifted to something approaching desperation. My cousin's messages were the hardest to hear. She was crying in most of them, asking why I'd chosen to ruin her wedding day. She kept saying she didn't know I was the one paying for everything, and that if she had known, she would have stopped Dad from saying what he did. Her new husband left a message too, trying to sound diplomatic while clearly being furious about having his wedding reception cut short. But it was my uncle's message that really got to me. The same uncle who had laughed at my dad's characterization of me as a disappointment left a voicemail explaining how I'd misunderstood the situation, how it was all just family joking around, and how I'd overreacted. He seemed genuinely baffled that I'd taken offense to being publicly humiliated after secretly funding their celebration. The next morning brought a new wave of contact attempts. Family members who'd been at the wedding were calling to get my side of the story, though I suspected many of them were just looking for gossip material. A few cousins reached out to express support, saying they'd been shocked by what Dad had said and that they understood my reaction. My aunt, my cousin's mother, left a particularly emotional message. She was torn between being grateful for my generosity and being devastated that her daughter's wedding had ended in such chaos. She begged me to call her back, saying the family needed to work this out somehow. I decided to respond to exactly one person, my cousin. She deserved to hear directly from me why I'd made the choice I did. When I called her back, she was still upset, but she listened as I explained my perspective. I told her I was sorry that her special day had been affected, but that I couldn't sit quietly while being publicly humiliated by people who had been benefiting from my generosity without even knowing it. She admitted that she'd been shocked to learn I was behind all the extras that had made her reception so special. She'd assumed her parents had arranged everything, or that the groom's family had contributed more than they'd actually committed to. Learning that her black sheep cousin had been the one ensuring her dream wedding could happen had been a revelation. She asked if I could somehow undo what I'd done, maybe pay the venue retroactively so the guests could remember her wedding for the right reasons instead of the dramatic ending. I had to explain that it wasn't that simple. Once I'd revoked the payment authorization and left, the venue had been within their rights to end the services immediately. Update 2. A week after the wedding disaster, I learned more about what had happened after I left. According to my cousin, the venue manager had given them 30 minutes to come up with payment for the remaining bar service and DJ time, or the reception would end immediately. The groom's parents had tried to cover the costs, but the amount was substantial, much more than they'd budgeted for or could easily handle on the spot. Some of the wedding party had started a collection among the guests, which was apparently both touching and humiliating for my cousin and her husband. Imagine having to ask your wedding guests to chip in money so the party could continue. Eventually, they'd managed to scrape together enough to keep the bar open for another 2 hours, but the mood never recovered from the dramatic interruption. My dad had apparently spent the remainder of the reception trying to explain to anyone who would listen that there had been a misunderstanding, that he hadn't meant what he'd said the way it sounded. But the damage was done. Everyone now knew that the family's supposed disappointment had actually been their secret benefactor. The story spread beyond the wedding guests. Other family members who hadn't attended started hearing different versions of what had happened, and soon I was getting calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were critical of my actions, saying I'd gone too far and embarrassed the whole family. Others were curious about this hidden generous side they'd never known existed. My business partner, who knew about my habit of anonymous family contributions, told me he'd been waiting for something like this to happen. He'd warned me years ago that hiding my generosity would eventually backfire, that family members would continue to take me for granted if they didn't understand how much I was actually contributing to their lives. I started getting indirect information about other family events I'd secretly supported over the years. Birthday parties, graduation celebrations, holiday gatherings. My anonymous contributions had been more extensive than even I'd remembered. Family members were apparently going back through recent events, trying to figure out what else I might have paid for without taking credit. The revelation was causing its own kind of family drama. People were feeling embarrassed about criticisms they'd made of me while unknowingly benefiting from my generosity. Others were angry that they'd been kept in the dark about who was actually funding various family activities. My cousin called again, this time with a different perspective. She'd had time to process everything and wanted me to know that she understood why I'd reacted the way I did. She'd also been talking to other family members and learning about the pattern of anonymous support I'd been providing for years. She told me something that really struck home. She'd always wondered why our family gatherings seemed more elaborate than what she knew the family budget could support. The quality of venues, the open bars at celebrations, the upgraded catering. She'd assumed someone was just good at finding deals, not that someone was quietly covering the difference in cost. She asked me why I'd kept it secret for so long, why I hadn't let people know I was helping out. I had to think about that question for a while before I could answer it honestly. Part of it was that I genuinely wanted to help without making it about me, but part of it was also that I'd been afraid of the family dynamics that would come with everyone knowing I had money to spare. Update 3. 3 weeks after the wedding, my dad finally showed up at my apartment unannounced. I'd been avoiding his calls and hadn't responded to any of his messages, so I guess he decided a face-to-face conversation was necessary. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, I almost didn't let him in. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what he had to say after all this time to think about it. He started by apologizing, which caught me off guard. He admitted that what he'd said at the wedding was wrong, that he'd been trying to make conversation with the groom's parents and had fallen back on old family dynamics that weren't fair to me. He claimed he hadn't meant to hurt me, that it was just the way he'd always talked about my different life choices. I told him that was exactly the problem. He'd gotten so comfortable diminishing me in front of others that he'd done it automatically, even while I was secretly paying for the very event where he chose to humiliate me. He looked genuinely surprised when I laid out the full extent of my anonymous contributions over the years, admitting he'd had no idea I'd been involved in so many family celebrations. That's when he asked the question I'd been dreading. Why had I been doing it? Why had I been quietly paying for things without telling anyone, especially when I knew some family members didn't think highly of my life choices? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since the wedding disaster. I explained that it had started small, just helping out here and there when I knew someone was struggling financially but was too proud to ask for help directly. Over time, it had become a habit, a way of contributing to family unity without having to navigate all the complicated dynamics that came with everyone knowing I had money to share. I thought I was avoiding drama by keeping it anonymous, But instead I'd been setting myself up for exactly the kind of situation that had exploded at the wedding. He asked if I regretted what I'd done at the reception, if I wished I'd handled it differently. I had to be honest. Part of me did regret the timing and the public nature of my reaction. My cousin didn't deserve to have her wedding day become a family drama spectacle. But I didn't regret standing up for myself. And I didn't regret making it clear that I wouldn't tolerate being treated as a disappointment while secretly bankrolling family celebrations. Dad then did something that surprised me. He asked if there was a way to move forward that didn't involve cutting ties completely. He acknowledged that the family dynamics had been unhealthy, that they'd taken advantage of my generosity while simultaneously disrespecting me. He wanted to know if we could rebuild the relationship on more honest terms. I told him I was willing to consider it, but that things would have to be different going forward. No more anonymous contributions, no more accepting criticism while secretly supporting family events, and definitely no more tolerance for being publicly diminished. If I was going to help family members, it would be openly and with the respect that kind of generosity deserved. He agreed to those terms, though I could tell he was struggling with the shift in family dynamics that this would require. For years, he'd been comfortable seeing me as the family member who didn't quite measure up, while unknowingly benefiting from my success. Adjusting to a reality where I was actually one of the more financially stable family members was going to take time. The conversation ended with a tentative agreement to have dinner the following week, along with my mom, who'd been staying out of the drama but was apparently eager for family reconciliation. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a start toward a more honest relationship. Looking back on the whole situation, I realized that the wedding disaster was probably inevitable. Years of hidden resentment and mismatched perceptions were bound to explode eventually. The only regret I have is that my cousin's special day became the stage for that explosion. But sometimes dramatic moments are what it takes to force long overdue conversations about respect, family dynamics, and what we actually mean to each other. The anonymous generosity that I thought was avoiding family drama had actually been enabling it, allowing people to maintain comfortable misconceptions about who I was and what I contributed to our family. Moving forward, everything would be more honest, more complicated, perhaps, but definitely more real.